After his death, Boz Scaggs' wife, Dominique, finally breaks her silence. When Boz Scaggs died in 2024, the headlines were respectful. Legend lost. Silk Degrees icon passes at 79. But as the tributes poured in, one voice was notably missing: Dominique Scaggs, his wife of over 3 decades. She remained silent. No interviews, no appearances, no tribute. And then, almost a year later, she finally spoke. What she revealed shattered the image of quiet luxury and marital bliss that surrounded Boz in his final years. What was hidden behind their estate gates? What grief was she silenced from expressing, and by whom? Let's rewind the story. Dan Fogelberg was never built for fame. Not the kind that came with bright lights and screaming crowds. His genius was quieter, a reluctant star whose songs wept rather than roared. He didn't chase fame. It found him anyway, and it never quite fit. Born in Peoria, Illinois in 1951, Daniel Grayling Fogelberg grew up surrounded by music and contradiction. His father, Lawrence, was a disciplined high school band director, a man who believed in structure, repetition, and restraint. His mother, Margaret, was the opposite, a classically trained pianist who taught young Dan that music was emotion before it was anything else. From them, he inherited a sacred duality: order and longing. By the mid-1970s, Fogelberg had become an unlikely juggernaut. His albums Souvenirs, Captured Angel, and Netherlands carved a niche of emotional depth in an era dominated by arena rock and electric swagger. He sang of memory, loss, and the passage of time, of love found in fleeting glances and lost in snowy streets. Songs like Longer, Same Old Lang Syne, and Leader of the Band weren't just hits. They were hymns of vulnerability in a world increasingly armored. But tenderness has a cost. Dan never quite fit in with the denim-clad gods of the rock pantheon. He was too poetic for radio executives, too sentimental for the press, and too earnest for the posturing cynicism of the late 70s. Critics dismissed him as soft. They missed the steel beneath the sorrow. Privately, Fogelberg wrestled with perfectionism and solitude. Fame had gifted him adoration, but it stole his privacy, warped relationships, and made every imperfection a headline. By the late 80s, he began to retreat. The albums slowed, interviews ceased, tours grew rare. He bought land in Colorado, surrounding himself with mountains, wildlife, and silence. But that silence wasn't peace. It was armor. It was absence. And beneath it, something darker was beginning to take root. Something that would soon pull him even further from the world that once knew his name. By the time John entered Dan Fogelberg's life, he was already fading into the background, not forgotten, but folded into memory. He had weathered the storms of fame, endured the dismantling of 2 marriages, and grown weary of an industry that once adored him, then turned indifferent. His fans still held him dear, but Dan himself had grown elusive, almost ghost-like. He met Jean sometime in the mid-1990s, in the quiet spaces where fame didn't reach. She was an artist, a painter and photographer, not a groupie or an industry fixture. She wasn't impressed by Dan's past or swayed by his legacy. She saw something else, someone else, and that was precisely what he needed. They moved slowly, privately. Jean offered presence without pressure, a stillness that matched his own. They married quietly in 2002. No press release, no label endorsement, just 2 people choosing each other in defiance of spectacle. For a man who once lived in the spotlight, this anonymity was its own kind of sanctuary. To outsiders, John was barely a shadow. She rarely appeared in public, gave no interviews, avoided gossip columns, but inside their mountain home, she was everything: confidant, gatekeeper, caretaker. She ran interference. She filtered requests. She shielded him from the chaos he'd left behind. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some of Dan's old collaborators, musicians, producers, even friends, began to notice they were being quietly pushed aside. Sessions postponed, projects shelved, calls unanswered, whispers circled. Was Jean protecting Dan or controlling him? But others told a different story. They saw a man who had finally found peace, and a woman who had helped him reclaim it. After decades of carrying the weight of others' expectations, Dan had found someone who asked for nothing but honesty. John didn't just love Dan Fogelberg the icon, she loved Dan the man, flawed, fragile, fading. And when the shadows grew long and the silence deepened, she didn't flinch. She stayed. In the end, she would be the only one present when everything began to unravel. And the only one with the courage to tell the story no one else dared to. Their marriage was brief, just 5 years long, but it bore the gravity of a lifetime. And it was forged in fire. In 2004, Dan Fogelberg was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer. The news came not as a slow whisper, but as a blunt force. It was late stage, aggressive, unforgiving. Doctors gave him months, not years, not time, just a countdown. Jean, already the quiet fortress of their life together, stepped into another role, warrior. She threw herself into research, treatment options, alternative therapies. She transformed their Colorado home into a sanctuary of survival. Light, air, clean food, acoustic guitars, journals. Dan was not ready to die, and Jean refused to let him surrender. They turned inward, retreating even deeper into the mountain silence. But this time, it wasn't about escape. It was reverence. Each day became ceremonial. Small joys made sacred by the ticking clock. Dan wrote constantly, not albums, but letters, musings, farewells, songs he never intended to release. Words meant only for Jean. Outside their circle, rumors began to swirl. Why had Dan vanished again? Why no tour, no press? Some speculated burnout, others whispered depression. But the truth was grimmer and more private than anyone could have imagined. Dan never made a public announcement. No final statement. No last record. His pain was his own, and he guarded it fiercely. In a world obsessed with oversharing, he chose disappearance. And Jean stood between him and the world like a locked door. Remarkably, he outlived his prognosis by nearly 3 years. Those stolen years were spent in grace and grief, filled with morning coffees, whispered memories, and unfinished songs. Not for fans, for themselves. When Dan died in December 2007, the world mourned the loss of a voice. Radio stations played "Leader of the Band." Old interviews resurfaced. Tribute concerts followed. But Jean didn't just lose a musician. She lost her partner, her sanctuary, her reason. And unlike the fans, she didn't get to press play and hear him again. She was left with the silence. The kind that doesn't fade, the kind that stays. The estate in Napa Valley was breathtaking. 30 acres of vineyards, stone fountains, and curated beauty. It stood like a cathedral to taste and success, framed by iron gates and guarded by silence. To visitors, it looked like a sanctuary. But to those who lived inside, it felt more like a fortress, and its foundation was cracked with secrets. Boz had always been a private man, but over the years, that privacy hardened into secrecy. At first, Dominique didn't question it. A closed-door call here, an unexplained trip there. She assumed it was business, music. Men like Boz were always scheming, reinventing, escaping. But the patterns shifted. The absences lengthened. The explanations thinned. He stopped confiding in her, stopped including his longtime team in financial decisions. There were offshore accounts, quiet lawsuits, business partners whose names Dominique had never heard. More than once, he disappeared for days under the pretense of writing. But she knew better. When she asked where he'd gone, Bangkok, Berlin, Marseille, he'd smile and say, "Nothing you need to worry about." And that was that. But Dominique did worry, quietly, internally. She began keeping track, emails, flight itineraries, voicemails he forgot to delete. She wasn't trying to expose him, not yet. She was trying to understand what had become of the man she married, and more importantly, where she stood in the growing architecture of omission. Over time, the estate began to feel like a museum. Every rug, every painting, every wine-stained dinner felt like a set piece in a play she hadn't auditioned for. Boz played the role of the charming, elusive host. Dominique played the wife, who smiled politely and asked no questions. But questions kept coming, from friends, from colleagues, from herself. Why were old bandmates suddenly cut out of projects? Why were financial statements doctored? Why were certain names, women mostly, whispered at parties, then forgotten by morning? She endured it all with quiet discipline. Her silence became her armor, her routine, a shield. But secrets like Boz's don't stay buried forever. Some wait until after the final curtain. Others begin to rise before the last song is even played. Boz Scaggs didn't just disappear, he dissolved. A master of exits, he could slip through the cracks of his own life with surgical precision. Whether it was a business deal, a friendship, or a marriage argument, Boz knew how to vanish without explanation. And over the years, those vanishing acts became part of his mystique. From his early days with the Steve Miller Band to his solo stardom, Boz was always in control of the narrative. He appeared when he wanted to be seen, vanished when the pressure rose, and returned just in time to remind everyone of his genius. Fans saw it as artistic temperament, but Dominique saw something else: manipulation. Each absence came with a price, and she was always the one who paid it. She cleaned up the messes, smoothed over broken contracts, answered calls from confused producers and concerned friends. For years, she justified it. She told herself it was the cost of loving an artist, that genius required retreat, that brilliance was inherently lonely. But eventually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Boz didn't vanish to find himself. He vanished to control others. Silence was his scalpel, absence his leverage. The less he said, the more people projected. The less he gave, the more they chased. It was a form of soft power, velvet lies stitched into his very presence. And Dominique? She became fluent in omission. She learned to perform warmth at events, to toast to anniversaries that felt like charades. The marriage wasn't entirely a lie, but it was built on selective truths, carefully rehearsed roles, private wounds dressed in public grace. There were nights she imagined walking away. But leaving Boz wasn't like ending a marriage. It was like resigning from a dynasty. He wasn't just a man, he was a brand, a legacy, a labyrinth. To leave him meant disentangling herself from a world she'd helped uphold. And she didn't know who she was outside of it. So she stayed. Not because she was afraid, but because she believed in something deeper beneath the deception. A belief that would one day be shattered, and eventually spoken aloud. The studio was Boz's sanctuary, a soundproof vault where reality couldn't reach him. More than the stage, more than his home, it was the one place he didn't have to perform. It was where he could manipulate sound instead of people, where the faders responded, the microphones listened, and the world made sense. But over time, even that sanctuary began to change. In the early years, his sessions were legendary. Creative marathons fueled by curiosity and collaboration. Engineers admired his ear. Musicians respected his vision. But something shifted as he aged. What once felt electric became tense, almost combative. Boz no longer trusted those around him. He questioned every edit, rejected every suggestion, fired people who had been with him for decades. Whole albums were scrapped, contracts dissolved. He'd spend months on a song, then abandon it overnight. And beneath that creative volatility lurked something else, something harder to define. The mood swings, the paranoia, the 3 a.m. rants, audio files emailed in rapid bursts, notes scribbled in the margins of lyric sheets, rambling voice memos that made little sense. Long days turned into longer nights, and more than once, Dominique found herself standing outside the locked studio door, unsure of what or who waited on the other side. She brought him food, checked for signs of drinking, of pills. But Boz would dismiss her with a cold smile and a few vague words. "I'm working. You wouldn't understand." And maybe she didn't, or maybe she understood too well. The studio had become more than a workspace. It was a bunker, a mirror, a mausoleum for the things he refused to face. His aging body, his fading relevance, his secrets. Dominique started to worry not just for his music, but for his mind. There were whispers among collaborators about memory lapses, erratic behavior, missed deadlines. Some wondered if it was addiction. Others feared it was cognitive decline. And when the music finally stopped, it didn't feel like a resolution. It felt like a disappearance. The end didn't come suddenly. It came in soft increments, withdrawals disguised as rest, silences framed as reflection. Boz Scaggs had been retreating for years. His 2018 album Out of the Blues was a quiet farewell in everything but name. The songs were mournful, smoky, unpolished, echoes of a man circling back to the music that shaped him. It was his way of closing a loop, even if he never said so aloud. He gave few interviews. When he did, he spoke in abstractions. "The world's too noisy," he told one radio host. "Sometimes the best thing a man can do is stop talking." It was the closest he ever came to admitting he was done. To fans, his fading was graceful. To Dominique, it was something else entirely. His health deteriorated in private. He refused most treatments, citing quality of life over longevity. He resented being fussed over, rejected all talk of legacy or estate. Dominique, ever composed, began to take the lead, organizing their affairs, fielding quiet inquiries from old friends, managing a life that was gradually dissolving. She noticed the house growing quieter. He no longer played the piano. He no longer hummed in the kitchen. Some mornings, he wouldn't get out of bed. He began sorting through old notebooks, then stopped, as if afraid of what he'd find. There were days when he didn't speak at all. When Boz finally passed in April 2024, it was with the same evasive grace he'd practiced all his life. No hospital room, no press statement, just a gentle fading in the home he once filled with music. Dominique didn't alert the media. She didn't stage a memorial. She issued a brief public statement, then withdrew. The industry mourned politely. Spotify playlists updated, tribute articles published. But the man they remembered wasn't the one Dominique had buried. They remembered the voice, the grooves, the mystery. She remembered the absence. And in that absence, a different story was just beginning to take shape. In the weeks following Boz's death, Dominique vanished from view. The Napa estate was sealed off, vines overtaking the drive like slow reclamation. Rumors swirled. Had she moved to Europe? Gone into seclusion? Some even suggested a mental breakdown. But Dominique wasn't unraveling. She was rebuilding, quietly, surgically. For decades, she had been the quiet architect of Boz's outer world, the poised hostess, the meticulous organizer, the woman who absorbed the chaos he refused to acknowledge. But now, with the silence finally hers to shape, she began to take it apart. The first ripple came in an unlikely place, a long-form feature in a niche California music quarterly. It wasn't a tell-all. There were no betrayals named, no accusations leveled. But for those who read carefully, the portrait was unmistakable. A woman who had lived in the orbit of a man too brilliant to connect, too adored to be questioned, too guarded to truly be known. "He didn't believe in mess," she said in the article, "so I learned to clean everything up before he noticed it." The interview reframed everything. Boz's mystique, long seen as the hallmark of a tortured artist, became something else, a shield, a fortress, a refusal. And Dominique, who had maintained that illusion for 30 years, was no longer willing to do so. She didn't appear on talk shows. She didn't tour grief like so many celebrity widows before her. She chose anonymity, not as exile, but as power. Her disappearance wasn't a collapse. It was an exit, the first one she'd ever chosen for herself. And quietly, beyond the spotlight, she began telling her story. Dominique had long suspected the end would bring a reckoning, but even she wasn't prepared for what the will revealed. It was complex, purposefully so. Layers of trusts and accounts spanning states and continents. Some properties were already transferred, others tied up in ambiguous foundations. Legal language blurred the lines between ownership and intention. She wasn't excluded, but she wasn't central either. Pieces of Boz's estate went to old collaborators, to vintage guitar museums, to boutique charities she'd never heard of. One Beverly Hills property was left to a man Boz hadn't spoken to in over 15 years. The vineyard, their shared project, was folded into a nonprofit with restrictive oversight, effectively removing Dominique from any decision-making power. No explanation, no personal note, no final words. To the world, Boz's posthumous generosity looked eccentric, even poetic, a musician giving back to the things that shaped him. But to Dominique, it was something else entirely. It was erasure, not out of cruelty, but habit. He had a way of making you feel grateful for the pieces he didn't take away. She confided to a family friend. That was his magic and his curse. She didn't contest the will. She didn't want the fight. She wanted the truth. Because now, for the first time, there was no one left to silence her. And that truth would take form not in court, but on screen, quietly, devastatingly, in a film that would do what Boz never could, let her speak. When Dominique finally stepped into the light, it wasn't to destroy Boz's legacy, it was to reclaim her own. In 2025, she quietly partnered with a documentary filmmaker known for archival deep dives into overlooked figures in American music. He had once preserved hours of unseen footage from the Silk Degrees sessions. Gritty, grainy shots of Boz rehearsing late into the night, surrounded by empty chairs and unspoken tension. Dominique brought something else to the table, a key, not to a vault of secrets, but to a long-locked room inside the myth. What she shared wasn't salacious. There were no revelations of scandal, abuse, or betrayal in the tabloid sense. Instead, she offered something more devastating: context. She opened boxes of handwritten notes, unsent letters, and private journal entries. She contributed voice memos Boz left her, clipped and cryptic. And most importantly, she sat in front of the camera, calm, composed, and devastatingly precise. "It's easy to love a ghost," she says in one of the film's final moments. "He gave the world the best of himself, and the rest, he left to me." The documentary, titled The Man Who Disappeared, didn't debut at Cannes or Sundance. It premiered at a modest film festival in Sonoma County, a deliberate choice by Dominique. She didn't want spectacle. She wanted accuracy, intimacy, closure. Critics described the film as quietly brutal, an unflinching look at the cost of genius and the people crushed beneath its weight. Through archival footage and Dominique's restrained narration, a clearer portrait of Boz emerged. Not a monster, not a victim, but a man hollowed out by his own mythology, who built a sound so smooth it smothered everything real. The world had long accepted Boz as a private genius. What Dominique revealed was the emotional collateral of that privacy. The way silence can stretch across decades and become a prison. The way love, if not reciprocated, becomes something colder than hate. She never once raised her voice. She didn't need to. Because in the end, it wasn't Boz's songs that lingered. It was her silence, finally broken, that echoed loudest of all. Dominique's long-awaited confession shattered the illusion of quiet elegance. What really happened behind the gates of Boz Scaggs' empire may never be fully known. But now, the silence has been pierced. Subscribe for more truths like this, and comment below. Was Dominique a devoted guardian, or the final editor of a legacy undone?